Just when you thought the big, beautiful bill had cleared its toughest hurdle, well, the Senate is going to step in. And, sometimes they have their personal agendas, and they definitely have a flair for the dramatic. So let's dive in to the next act of this legislative saga. And that's where a handful of senators could rewrite the script entirely. So here with more from D.C. is our Capitol Hill reporter, Rebecca Zelko. So, Rebecca, how did we even get here? How do we absolutely go through overnight votes and crazy things to get this big, beautiful bill passed in the House?
Well, it was certainly, as you pointed out, a very dramatic saga that really came to a head in these last couple of weeks. As you mentioned, there was a lot of these overnight votes, these overnight markups, and the vote itself on the big, beautiful bill, once it finally finished going through all of those committees, once it was finally put together and agreed upon, wasn't until 6:50, I believe, in the morning on Thursday. And this was, again, after another overnight markup. And so if the schedule in and of itself wasn't crazy enough, the drama leading up to the vote certainly was. There was obviously the SALT Republicans, a lot of those Republicans who are in blue states advocating for increasing the cap in the state and local deduction tax deduction. They definitely caused a lot of issues for the leadership going into the vote. They were really insistent on raising that cap. Mike Lawler specifically was very stubborn in these negotiations, and they finally agreed to a very generous $40,000 cap, which was $30,000 higher than the original cap, which was $10,000. A lot of math, but even more math coming from the fiscal conservatives like Chip Roy and Andy Harris, who just insisted throughout this process that there simply were not enough cuts. The work requirements need to be implemented earlier. There were all of these demands coming from the fiscal conservatives, the spending hawks, if you will, throughout this process that made it very complicated and that really delayed some of those negotiations. So much so that President Trump made a rare appearance on Capitol Hill this Tuesday. He came down to speak to the entire Republican conference, although we know which members he was speaking to more directly. And even after that, they weren't exactly persuaded. It took yet another private meeting with the president on Thursday, some of those House Freedom Caucus members, some of the Republican leadership to finally iron out those details and secure all of the votes necessary. And just to remind the audience, they really could not spare any votes. It ended up crossing the finish line in a 215 to 214 vote with Andy Harris voting present. And so it was a close call, but they managed to get it across the first hurdle.
Rebecca, I'm not going to judge you either way, but did you pull an all-nighter or did you actually sleep in and then wake up to it?
I was blessed enough to be able to sleep in. To an extent, I did wake up a little bit earlier than usual, but, I won't hold it against anybody. There were reporters who were out there literally curled up on some of those chairs and on the floor in the House press gallery, and so it could have been far worse, but I took the easy route, that's for sure.
I think that's good this time. That's good. Good for you. I'm glad that's the case. But I'm not feeling sorry for the people who did have to stay up and actually work for a living. That was a good thing. They went through their paces. Tell us a little bit more about this drama. I mean, who was mad and why? There must have been some angry people and some vicious moments.
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, first and foremost, with the all-nighter thing, it definitely took a toll on some members. I mentioned in that final vote, it was a 215 to 214 split, and that's because two Republicans actually missed the vote. One of them was trying to cast his vote. His name was Schweikert. He was trying to cast his vote, but it was just too late, so he barely missed it. And then another one, Congressman Garbarino, who's actually part of the SALT caucus, slept through the vote entirely. And so these members were definitely working a bit harder and a bit longer than they normally do. As for the actual drama, a lot of this obviously took place behind the scenes. But what we did see in front, in a more front-facing manner, was a lot of this was coming from the fiscal conservatives, the Andy Harris types, the Chip Roys. And Andy Harris, notably, he voted present. So even throughout this whole process, even though he said that they kept moving the needle, progress was made, that they were getting closer to a bill that he was more confident in voting for, he, in the end of the day, wasn't able to actually cast a vote in the affirmative. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in these next couple of weeks in the Senate and when it is inevitably returned to the House for more drama.
Yes, and let's get into that a little bit more because we know that the deadline, the theoretical deadline that they could move at any point in time, they moved it already for Memorial Day. Now it is the 4th of July. We had Chris Bedford. We were talking to him. He said, yeah, the House passed it for the first time, right? Alluding to the fact that it's going to go back there, right? If the Senate makes any changes, it's going to go back to the House. So how realistic is it looking at that July 4th deadline, knowing that the Senate is going to slow things down? They have, like we were saying, right, all the personalities that you have to deal with over there. Chris Bedford often says they're like their little islands that you have to deal with, and they all think that they're special. They're all important, so they all need to get things done. So how realistic do we think this July 4th deadline is?
I think like many of the other deadlines, it's going to be ambitious. I said the same thing about the Memorial Day deadline, and lo and behold, Speaker Johnson pulled it off again. And so anything could happen, I suppose. But we all know that they love to use these holidays as incentives to try and get some of the work done. Nobody wants to work through the most patriotic holiday, so I'm sure that there's a good incentive there. Now, something to keep in mind more in the long term is we of course have the beloved August recess, which is when lawmakers on both the Senate and the House side get the entire month off. Everybody books their vacations during this month, and so this is kind of a non-negotiable, like final worst case scenario deadline to keep in mind. Now, to your point about all of the different senators, how they all kind of have their own personal, these passions that they want to make sure are protected in this big, beautiful bill. For example, Senator Hawley, he has been really outspoken against reconciliation as it came out of the House. He said that the Medicaid reform is not something that he's interested in. He doesn't want to touch it at all. And of course, this has been one of the areas of progress that has been able to convince a lot of the fiscal Republicans to actually vote for the bill. So it's going to be a very interesting tension on that issue alone. And there's many others to keep an eye on as well. And so whether or not the Senate is able to get it done before 4th of July, I think the bigger question is, will the House actually accept the bill that the Senate is able to produce?
Yeah, so, we talked with Chris a little about this. I'm curious about your take. I mean, first off, this was a big win for Mike Johnson. I mean, I have to give him credit. We've been hard on him on this show at times, but this was a big win, the fact that this got out at all in the manner it did, like you said, before Memorial Day. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think that you're right. I mean, it is undeniably a victory for the speaker. Whether or not this was entirely his doing, I think that he can certainly take a lot of the credit for it. Of course, the president was there to help kind of expedite some of those negotiations to make sure that he was able to shepherd the Republican conference as much as he could. But even then, you still had some of the fiscal conservatives. You had the SALT Republicans who were just not willing to actually come to some sort of agreement until the very final moment. I will say, when I spoke with some of some of the House leadership earlier this week, the phrase I kept hearing was "nothing is final until it's final." And so it's definitely the attitude where it's like, okay, these negotiations are ongoing, they're difficult to actually nail down, but they're not going to be final until the final moment. And so rather than procrastination, I think that it's really more so just really focusing on finding that balancing point. That's another phrase they use a lot. Finding the balancing point in a conference that's honestly pretty diverse. It's always going to be a tall task, especially with such a narrow majority. So hats off to the speaker. You really got to give him credit where credit's due.
Rebecca, I wish I were out there with you for Memorial Day weekend. Have a great one, and we hope to see you back here soon on the show.
Likewise, see you guys.